Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Zipperstein, Faculty Director of the UCLA Unison Soraya Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. Very honored to have you all with us today for our very, very special and important webinar, officially launching Dr. Judea Pearl's landmark book, Coexistence and Other Fighting Words. Very honored as well to welcome UCLA's Chancellor, Dr. Julio Frank, in our audience today. Thank you, Chancellor Frank, for being with us. Speaking of our audience, we are joined by more than 300 people from the United States and 19 other countries. And permit me to read the names of those countries. I think you'll be impressed. We have people in the audience from Afghanistan, Andorra, Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, Colombia, Finland, France, Germany, Israel, Italy, Kenya, Mexico, the Netherlands, South Africa, Sweden, the United Arab Emirates, and the United Kingdom. Welcome, everyone. We're thrilled to have you with us today. Just a couple of housekeeping items before I introduce Dr. Pearl. First of all, we welcome questions from our audience. This is a tradition at the Nazarian Center. I will begin asking some of my questions of Dr. Pearl, but I really want to take as many questions from you, our audience, as possible. If you do have a question, please type it in the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And in order to allow me to read to Dr. Pearl as many of your questions as possible, I would ask you to please keep the questions brief. I assign my students term papers and essays, but I'm asking the audience to please write very short and succinct questions so that I can ask as many of them as possible. We also will post in the chat box. Again, if you click the chat, you will see a link to the UCLA bookstore where you can purchase signed autographed copies of Dr. Pearl's book, and we'll put this up again at the end of the webinar. Dr. Judea Pearl is the Chancellor's Professor of Computer Science and Statistics at the University of California, Los Angeles, and Director of the UCLA Cognitive Systems Laboratory. He's famed internationally for his contributions to artificial intelligence, human reasoning, and the philosophy of science, and has received numerous scientific awards, including the Turing Prize in 2011, which is the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for computing. And the committee recognized Dr. Pearl for his fundamental contributions to artificial intelligence through the development of a calculus for probabilistic and causal reasoning. I also want to mention that Dr. Pearl holds honorary doctorates from 7 different universities, among them Yale, Carnegie Mellon, and the University of Toronto. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences and the National Academy of Engineering, a fellow of the Royal Society, the Royal Statistical Society, the Cognitive Science Society, and the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence. Dr. Pearl was born in the town of Bnei Brak, Israel, which his grandfather, Chaim Pearl, founded in 1924. Dr. Pearl, also, of course, known to all of us as the father of Danny Pearl, the Wall Street Journal reporter who tragically murdered in Pakistan on his way to an interview in January of 2002. And afterward, Dr. Pearl, together with his late wife Ruth and their daughters Tamara and Michelle, formed the Daniel Pearl Foundation to continue Danny's life work of dialogue and understanding and to address the root causes of his tragic death. The Daniel Pearl Foundation sponsors journalism fellowships, organizes concerts around the world, and promotes a hate-free world through lectures and public dialogues. Dr. Pearl in 2006 was co-recipient of the Purpose Prize for forming the Daniel Pearl Dialogue for Muslim Jewish understanding, together with Pakistani diplomat and scholar Akbar Ahmed. Dr. Pearl, we are honored to have you with us today and to formally launch your very, very important book, Coexistence and Other Fighting Words, published in December 2025, a compilation of your many, many writings over the last 24 years. I just want to say at a personal level, the book is profoundly important, should be read by anyone who is concerned about the very, very scary increase in anti-Semitism and other forms of um, hate directed at Jews, directed at those who view themselves as Zionist. A very, very important book. Whether you agree or you disagree with Dr. Pearl's writings, at least read the book to get more information. Dr. Pearl, I want to begin by asking you, if you wouldn't mind, tell us about this very provocative title, Coexistence and Other Fighting Words. Why is coexistence a fighting word? Why did you uh, choose those particular words for the title of your book?
I'm glad you asked this question because for two reasons. Reason number one is because the title encapsulates the entire message that the book trying to convey. And number two, because it demands explanation. And it is provocative indeed, because it has here a combination of two concepts. One is a highly noble concept called coexistence, which nobody object to in our peace-loving society. And the other one is contains the word fighting, which evokes the notion of violence, which we are all against. I have to explain it. And I resorted to this after realizing that indeed some conflict in the world, those that are prolonged and hard to resolve, have a certain characteristic. And the characteristic is that one or two sides, primarily one side, views the idea of coexistence to be a humiliating defeat. So when you have such as a side in the conflict, it's very hard, perhaps even impossible to resolve. A typical and the most widely known example is the jihadi Salafi Islamic attitude, according to which the world and the history is a constant war between the house of peace and the house of uh, fighting. It's called Dar el Harb and Dar el Salam, uh, um, which and the view goes that it is an individual or religious obligation for any individual of a given faith, sorry, of a given faith to um, make sure to continue and expand the house of peace, namely those dominated by Islamic faith, okay, at the expense of the house of war, Dar el Harb. Okay, less known conflict with that characteristic is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Here, it's not very well known that the same idea um, governs this conflict. And as a matter of fact, very few people regard it and view the conflict in those terms. I call it the elephant in the living room, which I have elaborated and explained in several several chapters in the book. Okay? So I will just touch here on the basic principle here. Okay, I'm not the first one to identify to characterize the conflict in those terms. The first fellow was Ernst Bevin, who was the foreign minister of England after the war, and he wasn't a good friend of Zionism, but on February 18 of 1947, he had to explain to the British Parliament the reason why he decides to defer the conflict to the UN. Also he had to explain why he renegade on the Britain obligation to establish a national home for the Jews, but that was secondary. The main point, he had to explain why Britain is giving up such a beautiful real estate, okay, situating in a very strategic point, and he had to justify his decision. And his words were like that: you have in Palestine two nations, 1.2 million Arabs and 600,000 Jews, and and they have basic, what you call essential point or essential principles. The Jews have one essential principle, which is to establish a state, to gain a state, and the Arabs have another principle, which is to prevent Jews from having a state. That was his words. And no, to fight to the last to prevent Jews from having a state. Okay. And that, he said, is by definition, and if you know a little logic, you see that this is really a contradiction. So by definition, he said, these are irreconcilable. And because of that, we have deferred it to the UN, namely, it's not our responsibility, let the UN decide. And the UN have decided, as we know, and now, this was the first characterization of the conflict to be asymmetric. One side wishes to have coexistence, the other one sees the idea of coexistence to be a humiliating defeat. Okay. Now, I normally, when I mention Ernst Bevin, people come back to me and say, but this was 79 years ago. What are you talking now? In the meantime, we had Oslo, and we had Camp David, and we have Arafat declaring that he's going to renounce violence, and we had Annapolis and other offers back and forth. Why is it relevant to our days? Well, it is very relevant because people fail to appreciate how consistent it is throughout these years. People fail to appreciate the depth and the scope of this view, the depth at which Palestinians feel that Israel is infringed on their honor, that Israel is, that Tel Aviv is built on stolen land, okay? And not only the depth, but the scope. How many, what percentage of the Palestinian population feel that way? People normally say, okay, but definitely you have some, maybe 10% of them who are willing to accept Israel. Well, I'll quote to you Dr. Einat Wilf, okay, who spent 19 years counting how many Palestinians are willing to accept Israel as a permanent fixture in the Middle East, okay? And the answer is not 4%, but 4 people, okay? That's her words. Recently, we revised it to 4.5. But unless we shock the audience with the number 4, okay, the Western mind cannot comprehend the consistency and the scope and the depth of this belief among the Palestinian, and not only Palestinian, but Muslim world. And we are talking here about a Muslim world which counts 2 billion people. And I describe it in one of the chapters in my book on my trip to Doha, where I was extremely surprised and disappointed to see that the idea of two-state solution hasn't begun to penetrate the upper surface of the Muslim scholar. I'm using shocking words because I want to impress people at the degree of disappointment I had. Okay? No one among the enlightened Muslims, these were moderate modernity-seeking scholars from the Muslim world are getting together with America to see in what way they could achieve democratization, modernity, and multiculturalism and tolerance in the Muslim world. And the idea was if you want us to progress, if you, American, want us to progress, we are doing you the favor of us progressing on one condition. Give us the head of Israel on a platter, namely, erase Israel from existence. On that condition, we are willing to give you the favor of progressing. That was the idea I was disappointed with. It was made very clear to me, one by one. They told me Israel, Jews should build themselves a Vatican next to Jerusalem, but sovereignty, forget it. They are not a nation. We Muslims were chased out of Spain, and we see it as final. And you have been chased. You were chased out by the Romans. You should consider it as final, and that's it. So that brings me to another point. Uh, why I consider the no, I will end
Do you mind if I
positive.
interject here,
Yeah,
Dr. Pearl? Um, I think in fairness, I should push back
yeah.
and indicate and ask you to explain if what you're saying is the case for the Muslim world, then how do we explain the fact that Egypt and Jordan have signed peace treaties with Israel, Egypt in 1979, Jordan in 1994, the United Arab Emirates um, joined the first country to join the Abraham Accords, along with Bahrain and Morocco, Sudan. Um, how do we explain these normalization and peace treaties with Israel and reconcile that with what you just mentioned? And I also wanted to just uh, ask you to comment in that regard on a quote from that I've heard you say many, many times, and it's in several of the chapters of your book where you describe the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians as, in your words, you call for two states, for two peoples, equally indigenous and equally legitimate. So how can we move that forward, both in the region, as well, where some countries have signed peace treaties, as well as, and I want to bring the discussion to the U.S., to our campuses, to the American Jewish community, as we
Sure,
segue into
sure.
that. Go ahead, Dr. Pearl.
Yeah, you asked me two different questions. First, the peace treaties with Jordan and Egypt was a matter of expediency. It was convenient for both countries, but the peace was extremely cold. Egyptian journalists, for instance, are not allowed to go to Israel and cover Israel. The tourism is only one side. Israeli tourists can go to Egypt, but not the other way around. Okay, and so it's a very cold one, which means that the mindset of the Arab street is still against Israel. Not only against Israel, cannot accept the idea of Israel as a legitimate solution. Okay. I should also say that you should ask me, and what about Israel? Is Israel really accepting the idea of coexistence? Today, it seems like it's a far-fetched vision. No. If you look at the history of Zionism, and if you look at the mindset with which Zionism was formed and continued to operate and compromise, that was the utopia. Our steady state is peace with our neighbors. Two states for two people. And I have a whole chapter on that in the book, which describe the mindset of the early Zionists as they came there, including Herzl and Ben Gurion, the way they treated the Arab population in Eretz Israel at that time in 1917 and then in 1931 and so on. Okay, so I did my studies. That has been the both the utopia and the working uh, ideology of Zionism from day one and until today. We have indeed problems with the extreme right wing, which, at least on the surface, they speak as though they would like to annex the West Bank, and they don't. They want to. Some of them even go as far as encourage the Arab to leave, and so on. This is only rhetoric. Deep inside, every Israeli is committed to two-state solution. And okay, I will go back now to the second question. You asked me about the how we recognize the Abraham Accord. That has been a breakthrough. The Abraham Accord, indeed, with the UAE, was the first break through this ceiling. So it can be done. It does tell us that it can be done on the basis of what? The name of Abraham. The image of Abraham tells both sides we both belong here. None of us is foreigner, right? Because we have a common ancestor, Abraham, and he was promised this land. Metaphorically, I'm not a religious person. Metaphorically, he was promised this land, and he made this land his home by cash. And the scripture emphasized the fact that he bought that place in Hebron by cash. Okay. So and that was important. And indeed, in UAE, I've noticed a change in mind. It's hard still to know to what degree it penetrates the street because they don't have free press, even in UAE. Yeah. So, but I saw with my own eyes and with my own ears, I heard the symphony of Bahrain playing Hatikva in Santa Monica. Okay, so for me that constitute mutually, equally indigenous attitude. Yes. Okay, I hope I answer it to its fullest. Your question about the Abraham. So
Yeah.
it shows a feasibility. The Arab mind can be transformed, but we must be careful and understand what needs to be transformed. What, what kind of transformation is required to achieve this idea of mutual recognition and the beginning of the process of two states for two people. First, it must come with the idea of people. We should be recognized as people by our neighbors, and not merely as a religion which is constantly being uh, confused.
Well, that's a great way for us to get into. And by the way, I already have a number of wonderful questions from the audience. This will be my last question to Dr. Pearl, and then I'm going to turn to your questions during the next half hour, our final half hour together. Dr. Pearl, you in your writings have drawn a distinction between anti-Semitism on the one hand and a term that you coined, Zionophobia, on the other hand. Um, and there's obviously now in the United States a huge debate within the Jewish community and more broadly about whether anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism. Is anti-Zionism a form of anti-Semitism? We had assumed for a long time that most Jews in this country identify as Zionists, and so anti-Zionism would therefore be presumed to be a form of anti-Semitism. But last week, a new survey was published by the Jewish Federations of North America, a survey of American Jews in which 88% said, yes, we believe that there should be a Jewish state called Israel, but only 37% of the respondents identified as Zionist. And so help us unpack the potential confusion between anti-Semitism, Zionism, Zionophobia. Just please give us your thoughts about that. This may take a few minutes, but this is so important and so core to the theme in your book.
Yeah, first, why I chose the word xenophobia and distinguish that from anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism used to be regarded as evil or a racist kind of attitude, because Hitler gave a bad name for anti-Semitism. So no respectable person would come forward and say, "I'm an anti-Semite." Okay, and then that attitude was, um, and anti-Zionism is something less of the two evils, because you only deny Israel the right to exist, but you don't touch the worst of the two evil, which the Jewish people in themselves. You only talk against Israel. But now, at that point, anti-Zionism became a cover for anti-Semitism, and even Jews were claiming that, asking at what point will it cross or spill over to be harmful to Jews, as opposed to harmful for Israel and its policies. Okay? So I coined the name xenophobia to press one important point. Even if it was not touching any Jew in America, it's still evil and racist. Okay? You're talking here about committing 8 million people, refugees and or descendants of refugees, to eternal statelessness in a region which is not known to be polite. Okay? That is genocide enabler attitude. And that is, of course, it is also a racist attitude, because you deny one people self-determination, which you grant to other people of the same kind of category, definitely not even with the rich history the Jews have. So it has the characteristic of being, number one, racist to the first degree, and number two, harmful and genocide enabler. That was the reason. So my idea was that we must be able to voice it in a word, to coin one word in which the accusation targets the accuser and not us. And I've seen on campuses constantly we are trying to apologize and prove our innocence against a constant barrage of accusation. And the atmosphere was the Jewish students, yeah, and Zionists are constantly being, in Israel, is being blamed from something, is being put on trial, put on trial. The charge would vary from year to year. And the people placing the charge rotates from year to year, but the idea was, and their idea was, it doesn't matter if the resolution or the charge or the accusation is accepted or denied, or what matters is that they do have a microphone and a stage, and they put Israel on trial. And the idea of xenophobia was, you're on trial too. You, the accuser, is a racist, and that's where I use the word phobia, and you're irrational. It has two elements there. Phobia means irrational behavior, or irrational, you have to say irrational reasoning, irrational thinking, okay? And also it rhymes with Islamophobia. And Islamophobia, is the greatest cardinal sin on campus. Okay? So the idea was, we want to be treated like Muslims, with the same reverence and with the same respect and as Muslims do on campus. And we haven't received that kind of treatment, because the Zionism, or anti-Zionism, was treated as a political opinion. our American both laws and attitude is to fight ferociously against discrimination on the basis of religion, but political opinion is protected from all sides, right? No more. This is our religion. We are talking about identity. Zionism is our identity, and as being our central identity, we would like it to be treated on the same level as religion. Religion does not have a monopoly on human sensitivity or human identity. So that is the point for coining the word Islamophobia. When you are anti-Zionist, you are committing people for genocide, you are racist, and number two, you are uh, entrenching on the identity of a large segment of the faculty and the students here. And that should not be the case on campus. Okay? No group should trample on the identity of such a large segment of another group, okay, and with impunity.
So I'll just follow up quickly. We have so many great audience questions, which I really want to get to. But just to drill into this a little bit further, because this is so important, there are faculty around the country who would say, I'm not an anti-Semite. I'm not against the Jews as a people, but I believe Israel is a settler colonial enterprise, et cetera, et cetera. There is academic scholarship that is peer-reviewed and published that supports that view. Why am I not allowed to teach that to my students? And what would your response be?
I like to remind you that eugenics too was a highly respectable field of studies in the 1950s and 1960s. Today, you wouldn't, the building, the Wilson building in Princeton was renamed because he was charged with, you know, eugenic tendencies, or at least racist tendencies. Shockley was shunned by the academic committee, the inventor of the transistor. Okay? Millikan, Millikan building in Caltech was renamed to be Caltech building. Okay? So society developed by recognition, by understanding that a certain field of studies are simply morally unacceptable. And the fight on the name here is really, you know, that anti-Semitism is protected by the First Amendment, right? Teaching racism is protected by the First Amendment and also by the principle of academic freedom. Yes, at the same time, we have another idea, another force here, which is norm of discourse. What is an acceptable norm of discourse on campus? And this is where the administration can exert their weight. And indeed, I can remind you that the chancellor has the mandate to dictate norm of discourse on this campus, not by imposing censorship on speech, but by reminding the campus about what is acceptable and non-acceptable norm of discourse. For instance, I always remind the campus that when Milo Yiannopoulos, an anti-Latinos speaker, came to campus, I think it was 2018, came, Chancellor Block said, I cannot stop you from speaking because you were invited by a properly registered student organization. But I can tell you that your values are not our values. And that was important for the campus to everybody on campus that got the idea that there are certain norms of discourse which are uncrossable, non-negotiable. Okay? And that was enough to for people to understand. Oh, I'm sorry. He also added an account of how important the Latino contribution is to the city, to the campus, and to the country as a whole. Okay? That should have been done also relative to Zionism, because I'm talking here about at least 400 faculty here. We have contributed to this campus and we have contributed to the city and so forth. So it's not unreasonable to ask from the chancellor or whoever is in charge of doing this kind of understanding to stand up and say, it's my mandate to set the norm discourse, and that kind of speech or that kind of teaching is not our value. It wouldn't be the first one because it was done by Marta Polak, the former president of Cornell. He came out and made this statement very clearly when BDS tried to push one of the resolution. He said that BDS is constantly conflating criticism of the government of Israel with the very right of Israel to exist, which I found to be troublesome. And that was a punchline. Look at this sentence. Look how wise it is and what it means. I find, first person, find to be troublesome. I, as a in charge of the norm of socially acceptable speech on this campus, I decide that to be troublesome. Okay? That pushed the BDS people for several years backward and made everyone. That is something which they fear most. It after every one of their resolutions, okay, against Israel, there will be somebody with authority, somebody from the administration, and get everybody on campus to understand this is not our values. And I
Yeah.
would like, moreover, I would like to explain to you what our values are. And I would like to tell you that Israel is very dear to me as a person. And I have the mandate to tell you what I think as a person.
Um, Thank you, Dr. Pearl. I'm going to group together some of the questions into kind of an omnibus question, and I'll ask you one or two questions, maybe three, and have you respond to them so that we can get as many of the audience questions as possible put to you. Thank you, audience. Please, we have time. Please send more questions. The first one is the following, and I'll read it verbatim. You say, Dr. Pearl, quote, racists stew in their own words, implying that exposure defeats debate. And the question is, in a media environment, social media and so forth, that rewards sensationalism and clicks and that sort of thing, how do we expose the racism without amplifying it further? That's a very important question. If you could think about that. While I ask you now a kind of a combined question here from several audience members who are concerned. You mentioned Muslim attitudes against recognizing the legitimacy of Israel. What about religious Jews, those who favor annexation, those in the West Bank, settlers who are attacking Palestinian villagers without any provocation whatsoever, without really any punishment, with impunity? What about the Jewish side of this equation and their refusal to recognize the legitimate rights of Palestinians? Again, two states for two peoples, equally indigenous. There are few people asking about that. And then finally, Dr. Pearl, several members of the audience are asking for your opinion about the creation under the auspices of the Trump administration of the so-called Board of Peace for Gaza, reconstruction of Gaza. I know it's a little bit off the topic of your book, but many members of our audience are very deeply interested in your thoughts about that. So if you could take those three questions in our next segment here.
You'll have to remind me what they are. Let me start with
Okay,
the
so the
first
first
one.
one
Just
is
one
about
word is remaining.
the
Yeah,
first one, racists
yeah,
stewing in their own
yeah,
words. If you could
yeah.
address that one.
My strategy for fighting uh, anti-xenophobia is to shame one xenophobe per day, expose and shame by name. Okay? If we all do that, how many xenophobes have you shamed in the past week? None, right? Let's look at next week. Choose one of your faculty members. You know who they are, right? Name them and expose them and shame them. I'll give you an example, okay? Remember the
Well, let's not
racist.
name names,
No, no,
but
no, 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 no
okay.
names. No, 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 no. We are here on the politically correct stage. No, no names. But we must name the uh, racist symposium that was conducted here at UCLA, okay, about a month ago, raising the question of whether Zionism is racism. Right? And the reaction was that 2 hours after that symposium, there was another symposium where the question is anti-Zionism racism? Okay, that is the kind of reaction that will make them ashamed of themselves.
Okay. Thank you. And the next question, just to refresh your memory, was about, and several, again, audience members asking about this, religious right-wing Jews, including settlers who aspire to annex, take over the West Bank, maybe even expel the Palestinians from the West Bank, settler violence. How do we deal with that in the context of your call for two states for two equally indigenous peoples?
Yeah, it's a terrible problem that Israel is facing. The messianic part of the right-wing government is really increasing its influence, and we know what internal politics brings about this kind of growth. It's a shame. It should be stopped, and I, I'm really worried about it. And I speak against it. And it's a problem that Israel is facing internally, and it it could only be resolved, I think, if we do have progress toward peace. And progress toward peace means step by step movement toward the utopia, which is two states for two people, and equally legitimate and equally indigenous. So there's a great hope in reviving the Abraham Accord, and I would say that um, part of this extremism was generated by hopelessness, seeing the other side not making a single move toward accepting us as people. I don't want to blame only the other side of what's happening internally in Israel. This is an awful stain on Israel's reputation, on our existence. And at the same time, we shouldn't underappreciate the stress under which Israel has existed for the past 78 years. It's amazing that this kind of, I would say, uh, madness that we see in the Messianic movement has not developed earlier. It's just think about it, what it means to be a Jew in Israel in the past 78 years. Constant harassment on the way under the shadow of a gallows. Okay, not a day, a single day of normalcy. Okay, 300, sorry, 30,000 dead to violence. Okay, who knows how many families destroyed, how many orphans and widows and maimed people who are injured. Okay, invalids. Okay, it's still under the shadow of the gallows of existential existence. Okay, and the world is quiet about that. The world, the best we can hear from the world is Israel has a right to defend itself, which is really shameful. Israel has a right not to need to defend itself. So, looking at at the conflict from this point of view, which is the experience of every Israeli, I'm surprised that this messianic movement has not developed earlier. So I hope that some progress toward peace will also resolve this internal problem that we have.
Okay. And then finally, the few questions about current situation, the Board of Peace, Gaza, et cetera. And I would also ask you to comment. Um, there was in popular uprising protests in Iran against the regime last month in January that was put down brutally by the regime. Estimates range from anywhere from 6,000 to 68,000 killed by the regime in the matter of about 3 days, which is far more than the number of civilians in Gaza, non-Hamas members, who died during the 2 years of the Israel-Hamas war. Why no protests anywhere on any U.S. campus about 68,000 potential deaths in Iran when we saw so much protest during against Israel during the Gaza war? So if you could talk about both those, Board of Peace, Gaza, then compare and contrast the Iran situation to Gaza in terms of the campus reaction.
The fact that we have inconsistency here doesn't surprise me because the protests on campus are generated by xenophobes. They care about one thing: undo Israel. That's the only thing they care about. Calculatingly and very let's say, purpose-minded and well-coordinated. So they don't care about anything else. Okay, that not surprises me. So what is the question? The kafia wearing students on UCLA campus do not care about Iran. That's obvious, right? They care about one thing: undo Israel. Okay, that doesn't. I hope I solved it. Okay, so
And then what about the Board of Peace in Gaza?
yeah,
What are your
I
thoughts
have
about
no
that?
opinion about it. I'm extremely worried to see Qataris and Turkish soldiers or even inspectors, okay, who are charged with the job of disarming Hamas. They wouldn't do it. Going back to my revelation in Doha, Qataris were brought up on the idea that they ought to support Hamas, and you expected them to disarm Hamas. It's inconceivable that anyone in the administration would even suggest that if he or she knew the depth of Qatari's belief in the demise of Israel and in the importance of Hamas in accomplishing this demise, they wouldn't even suggest it. So I'm very worried about this idea. I heard lately that there will be Indonesian soldiers charged with the task of disarming Hamas. I, I have few ideas, few experience with Indonesian. I don't believe they can do it. Okay.
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 Dr. Pearl, we have about 10 minutes left, 10, 15 minutes. I'm going to ask you a very short question and then a longer question from our audience again. And again, audience, thank you. Terrific questions. If anybody wants to sneak one last one in, please do so in the next couple of minutes, and I'll try to ask it. Dr. Pearl, one of our audience members uh, is basically asking, you've defined xenophobia during our session together, but could you offer us a definition of Zionism? And
Oh,
I think that's
easy,
really
easy.
important, particularly in light of the results of the survey conducted by the Jewish Federations of North America last week, where again, only 37% of US Jews identify themselves as Zionists. So maybe there's a confusion about what it means to be a Zionist. So
Yes,
if you could give us
I'm
your
glad because
definition, that'd be great.
we have in 4 days from now, from 2 days from now, we are marking the 130th anniversary for the appearance of Herzl Judenstadt, okay? And in the Congress, in Basel Congress, they spent 3 days in fierce debate on defining what Zionism is all about. And it's still relevant for today. Zionism seeks, if I remember it, I hope I remember it, Zionism seeks to establish in Palestine um, a, oh, publicly recognized and legally secured homeland for the Jewish people. That is, and there's nothing more than that. That is the idea of Zionism. It it was encapsulated in this sentence and it still remains encapsulatable in that simple sentence. Okay. Now, why is there a difference, a disparity between the number of Jews who are willing to declare themselves as Zionists and those that believe in the right of Israel to exist? Because our enemies have succeeded in contaminating the word Zionism with the consequence of the conflict. We do have problem in the Middle East, right? So we do have carnage and we do have violence and all kind of unpleasant consequences of the conflict. So of the conflict, our enemies have succeeded of attaching an association between the word Zionism as if Zionism is responsible for the consequences of the conflict, namely the suffering of both sides. Okay, therefore, but look, I am expert in cause and effect reasoning, and this is a reversal, an outlandish reversal of cause and effect. Okay, I'll give you an analogy. Okay, if the pregnant woman goes into a hasty procedure of abortion and gets infected, okay, you don't blame her husband for doing that. You blame those who try to prevent birth, to to conduct the abortion in the way they did. You blame them and not the natural process of human reproduction. Zionism is the natural process of Jews reestablishing themselves as a normal people. Okay? And those who try to prevent Zionism from accomplishing its goal are the ones responsible for the bad consequences that we see in the Middle East. That is my answer to the question of why the disparity between the two.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pearl. That's so enlightening. I also neglected to mention with apologies the Chancellor's Associate, Dr. Felicia Nall, Distinguished Professor of Medicine at the UCLA David Geffen School of Medicine, is also in our audience today. Thank you, Dr. Nall, for joining us.
She
Dr.
knows about
Pearl,
cause and effect.
Dr. Pearl, a group of your colleagues in the UCLA faculty would like me to ask you the following question. They say that some of them are exploring what they refer to as a quote escalation hypothesis, which they mean, for example, libel and defamation narratives can normalize a stigma, which can then lead to exclusionary behaviors and then lead to intimidation, and finally, in some instances, to institutional denial. This is their hypothesis. And they're asking you from a research perspective, what would be the key measurable indicators at each stage of this progression, from libel to exclusionary behavior and so forth? And what would count as evidence that early intervention could reduce later subsequent harm?
Uh, It's too hard for me to answer that. You know, it's really
It,
it has partly legal aspect and partly moral aspect. Okay,
yeah.
and it's hard to treat them on the same level. So I can't.
Okay. Well, we'll leave that to your
I
colleagues who
will
are looking at
say
that.
that the moral issue here is should prevail, and we
Yeah.
should continue to assert ourselves and against this manifestation of xenophobia that we see here on both the individual level and the departmental level, and we should continue and make it a routine. Shame one xenophobe a day.
Yeah. Dr. Pearl, we have time for just a couple more questions. Two members of our audience are asking more or less the same question. One audience member saying, you've kind of depressed us a little bit about the situation. Um, is there any hope for Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation, for your proposal for two states, for two equally indigenous people? And if so, from where do you draw your hope? From where do you draw that hope, Dr. Pearl?
First, I'm optimist by nature. Not only optimist, I'm joyful by nature. I draw my hope and my strength from looking at the Jewish history, okay? And I'm so proud and joyful that I belong to this tribe that has accomplished so much and and has been, I call it a scout of civilization, always thinking whether we are going in the right direction or not, and thinking against conventional wisdom. I'm very proud of that. Okay, so that is the main source of my hope and joy. Where do I see the conflict going? Okay, great hope, as I said, in the Abraham Accord, okay? And um, also great hope in our ability to get there by defining the problem. This is the first step. We, as Jews, we as Israeli, must define where we are going. We have, by defining where we are going, and with two states for two people, we also define the obstacles that stand in our way. Once we define the obstacles, we know how to address them. And I have in one of the chapters, I propose a way toward peace, practical way toward achieving that ideal by with the checkpoints along the way to measure our progress. And there will be a gradual process toward this much needed Palestinian change of mind. We must, this should, is a prerequisite. It's an educational process, and we are expert on education. So this mental transformation that can start by education, it means checking the textbooks, checking the building permanent housing for Palestinian refugees in the West Bank. Another checkpoint is giving up their status as refugees. These are uh, milestones that can be checked and measured along the process. And eventually, once we have an idea of what the obstacles are, we can address them and remove them. And if they're not removable, what can we do? We must live by the sword to the end of time. But
Okay, well, Dr. Pearl, on that note, I want to thank you so much for being with us today. Congratulate you on the launch of your very important book. Again, audience in the chat, we're posting the link to the UCLA bookstore where you can purchase Dr. Pearl's book. He will autograph the books. Um, I want to thank our audience sincerely for your superb questions. I apologize that I could not ask all of them. We will collect all the questions. Those that were not answered, we will send to Dr. Pearl. and ask him to type out some answers to your questions, and we will post the questions and answers on our website. We'll remove your names, we'll protect your anonymity, your identity, but we will post the questions and answers on our website. I want to thank our staff, our wonderful staff at the UCLA Nazarian Center for Israel Studies, who worked so hard to publicize this webinar, to put it together. I want to thank all of the other institutions who were involved in helping us get the word out about this webinar. And Dr. Pearl, I want to say something to you. Ordinarily, when we do these webinars, at around the 45th minute, we tend to see about 20% of the audience drop off. I've been looking at the attendance as we've been talking. We lost one person out of more than 200. Everybody has
Shame on
stayed
him.
tuned. Everybody has listened with such care and interest to what you've had to say. This has been a rare and very special treat for us to be able to host you. Thank you very much, Dr. Pearl, for your time today. Thank you to our audience. Please stay tuned. We have a number of very important webinars and programs coming up. You can check our website, the Nazarian Center. We have a new series with the Tel Aviv University Law School that we're launching on March 11th with the Dean of the Tel Aviv University Law School, Dr. Yishai Blank, who will be with us talking about the topic of could federalism save Israel, which lacks a constitution. And we also have Israel's former ambassador to Canada, Dr. Ronen Hoffman, who will be delivering our annual Harry C. Sigmund Distinguished Public Lecture coming up on February the 25th here at UCLA at the Fowler Museum. Check our website for details. Thank you all very much. Everyone be safe, and we'll see you again for our next program.
Thank
Thank
you,
you all.
Steve, for giving me this forum.
Thank you, Dr. Pearl. Bye-bye, everyone.